got to thinking a little bit about our economy and the credit crisis, and I think our illustrious leaders could learn quite a bit if they'd sit down and play the average massively multiplayer online game. Because one thing that happens almost universally in these games is you build your character, you accomplish various quests, and during the course of this, you're supposed to build up uh, whatever the currency of that game is. Usually it's units of gold, silver, or in some games it's credits, like Star Wars Galaxies. Anyway, basically the game will have a unit of currency, and your job as a player, among other things, is to accumulate this to buy things. Kind of like in the real economy. The people that manage the games and that control these virtual communities, they are always trying to crack down on gold sellers. Now, what these gold sellers are is these are companies usually operated out of Asia, somewhere hard to track, and they'll build characters in these games strictly for the purpose of building up a ridiculous amount of this in-game currency, like World of Warcraft gold or Guild Wars gold or Star Wars Galaxies credits. And they'll build this up and then they'll sell it to the other players inside the game in exchange for real world currency. Why are they so afraid of these gold sellers in these games? Well, if you as a player, rather than working through the game and accomplishing tasks in the game, if you can simply just pay usually a ridiculously small amount of money, real world money, and in exchange get a ridiculously high amount of this in-game money, a lot of players will do that instead of putting in the work and the effort to obtain the currency the honest way. And what that does is it tends to make all of the prices of the items in the game rise. So let's say you have 5 of a certain rare item in the game, and you as another player are trying to sell these, and all of a sudden you've got this influx of in-game currency that's so cheaply available, you're going to have a lot of potential buyers now who are willing to pay a lot more than they would have been willing to pay if they had to earn that money in the game. And so the prices go up. That's called inflation. It's when you increase the supply of the in-game currency relative to all the individual players, then that's going to raise prices because you have the same amount of potential buyers, but all of a sudden they're willing and able to pay a lot more than they could otherwise. That's called inflation. That happens in these games. You see it all the time. And so we can learn a lot about the real economy from this, except you're not going to hear this talked about in relation to the real economy. But it's something that happens and is just as simple in principle and just as easily observable in our own economy. So who are the gold sellers in our economy? Well, it's an institution called the Federal Reserve in the United States. Now, most Americans believe that the Federal Reserve, as the title would imply, is part of the United States government. That, in fact, is not true. The Federal Reserve is just a name. It's the name of this private corporation. It's no more federal than Federal Express, except for the fact that it is granted certain powers by our Congress. But its owners are private shareholders. And these are the gold sellers in our economy. Because what they do is the Federal Reserve will just flood the economy with more money. And our United States Congress is like the players in a MMO game who go to the gold sellers, or in this case the Federal Reserve. They get that money, that cheap money, and they spend it out into the economy. Now they get to use it at the current value. So when they spend that money initially, they're paying the prices based on the pre-inflation economy. And so they'll spend that money out into the economy. It filters out through the process of exchange, and then gradually, as a result, the prices go up to adjust. Now they've got something that was worth a lower amount of money, and the rest of us have to pay higher prices now. And the Congress does the same thing. And our Federal Reserve System has been doing this, doing what the gold sellers in these games do, since 1913. We've had this gradual erosion of the buying power of a dollar. You wonder why your grandpa says, back in my day, we used to be able to buy a candy bar for a nickel. Or why your grandfather bought his house for $20,000. Well, it's because of that gradual inflation over time. We've had 3 generations living under that, and it's been so gradual, we think it's just normal, but it's not. During the period from the end of the 1830s, when the Second Bank of the United States was abolished, until the Federal Reserve was in place, we had no central bank. The United States did not have one institution, like we have now, who had a monopoly on the money supply and was able to just inflate it at will. That did not exist during that time. And if you look at the prices over that period of time and what it would cost in dollars to buy, on average, the goods and services that Americans need, the dollar held its buying power over that period of time. And I'm wondering why we don't crack down on the gold sellers in the real economy, or the money sellers, the people who sell the money. Now, if you're not already angry at this, get a load of this. The Federal Reserve is a private company. They sell the money to our Congress, and they effectively allow the Congress to have, in effect, a giant overdraft protection on their account. The federal government is not limited at all by the amount of taxes it takes in. When it takes in a certain amount of taxes from the American people, it can spend well beyond that. In fact, it has been for years and years. That's called a deficit. They have an unlimited overdraft protection account on their bank account, so to speak. And that is enabled by the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve supplies the money to Congress. And then Congress, when they run a deficit, they just go to the Federal Reserve and say, hey, we need you to increase the amount of debt you'll let us run up. And so they do that every few years. Oh, and by the way, the American taxpayer is paying interest on every one of those dollars that is created by the Federal Reserve System. Congress was given the constitutional power to create the money and regulate it themselves, but I guess they decided they're too lazy to do it, so they've turned that power over to a private corporation, and they pay them interest. And you get somebody like Ron Paul who gets up there every month and confronts Bernanke, or whoever the current Federal Reserve Chairman is. He's been doing it for years. He'll get up there and said, why do you keep inflating the money supply? You know this is going to cause prices to go up. You know you're going to create a bubble. You know it's going to ruin our economy. He predicted what we're seeing now 30 years ago. And a lot of economists did too. They're called the Austrian school economists. People like Murray Rothbard, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, who won a Nobel Prize. There have been a lot of good economists predicting exactly what we're seeing now and talking about the effects of inflation, the money supply, and the bubbles that the Federal Reserve's intervention in the free market cause. And why don't we start listening to the guys who are right? You know, I heard Greenspan speaking just a few years ago. He said there was no real estate bubble. Why don't we start listening to the guys who've been right instead of relying on the guys who've been wrong to hopefully get it right this time?